Welcome everybody to Judaism 201. For those of you who saw the invitation, you know what the topic is. We're talking about Tehillim, Chaf Gimel, Tehillim 23, the famous one, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I think one thing that's interesting about this is that it's so famous. Everybody quotes it. When I was a kid, actually, I thought it was a Christian type. We had to say it in school, and I was like, why am I saying these Christian things? But on the surface, it seems like a very nice poetic expression of a theme that seems to be repeated in dozens of other Tehillim. So why is that one so much more famous? Is it just the poetry, or is there something deeper? So to tell you the truth, I don't know why it's necessarily so famous, but I can tell you why it's very important. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up the text on the screen to make it really easy for everybody. And here we go. So let's see. The Ibn Ezra, who is very short and concise with his words, when he talks about this Tehillim, his first three words, he says, "This is an important one," which is not often like him. So another commentator, the Das Mikra, points out that in part it's a response to of Tehillim 22. So Tehillim 22 here, the second pasuk, a very famous pasuk, Keli, Keli, my God, why have you abandoned me, or why have you forsaken me? The context of that, the Midrash says that this is a line that Esther said when she was walking towards Achashverosh's room or chamber, and she was very nervous. She had been fasting for 3 days. She wasn't feeling great mentally or physically. She just knew that she had to talk with him, and she didn't feel that God was helping out so much at the time, and that this was how she was feeling at the time. So some say that this chapter of Tehillim here, which is sort of the opposite, is in a way a response to this pasuk. I think that was an interesting way of looking at it. Rashi makes an interesting comment here also. The very next chapter, 24, starts off with LeDavid Mizmor. This one starts off with Mizmor LeDavid. For those, in davening, we say a lot of things that are Mizmor LeDavid. I didn't realize that there were I don't know how many Tehillim say LeDavid Mizmor. And what Rashi says is that in chapter 24, David HaMelech was inspired, and so he wrote this. Whereas when it says Mizmor LeDavid, it meant that he wasn't inspired, and so he had to find a way to inspire himself, and that he hoped and he learned to connect with Hashem, and that's why he wrote that. Here he's not at the top of the mountain. Okay, so what I'm going to do, the way we're going to do this, is I'm just going to briefly go through the whole chapter. It's only 6 pasukim, and then we're going to go back and talk about what it means and what the Tehillim is talking about. Okay, so we're pretty familiar. We may be very familiar with all of this, so we'll just go through it quickly. All right, Mizmor LeDavid, Hashem Ri Lo Aksar, Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. A shepherd obviously takes care of his flock, and David is saying, and the Lord is a shepherd, and the shepherd takes care of everything. Pasuk 2. one thing that's very interesting about this is that it's, as soon as you dig into the words, you find that the Hebrew is also very poetic and it's extremely hard to translate. And here's the first of many examples. I'll just bring up a couple of them. It makes me lie down in green pastures. Desha often means like grass or greenery. However, in the Tanakh, it doesn't always mean that. It can mean the midbar also. It can mean those little oases in the midbar. Midbar itself doesn't really mean desert so much as it means wilderness. And for those of us, I guess most of us have been to Israel, we sort of know what large parts of Israel looks like in terms of the wilderness area. We're not talking about like the Sahara Desert or the Negev Desert with lots of sand. We're talking about sort of like a craggy area with, a couple of trees here and there and some shrubbery here and there, that kind of wilderness kind of thing. And that's really, well, probably what the Hebrew words mean here, which you can't really translate in one sentence here. He leads me to waters of restfulness, tranquility. Again, that's hard to translate. May here is water. Menucha is rest, waters of rest, if you want to literally translate it. I heard somebody explain that what this meant was, if you imagine that you're a shepherd in the wilderness, when you get to those areas where there might be a tree with some shade, or it's an area where you can rest and the sheep can rest, and in particular the waters of tranquility. I thought this was really interesting. You sort of have to know a lot more about shepherding and sheep than I do, but what I heard is that that when a sheep drinks from a stream, the stream can't be running too fast because they might fall in and drown, and it can't be a very slow or still waters because then it'll have like algae in it, and it'll be sort of putrid for the sheep. So here he's sort of talking about the shepherd is being led to like the perfect place where you'd want to bring your sheep, where you can rest and the sheep can drink some water. He renews my soul. He guides me in the right path as befits his name. It's a little bit, again, hard to see exactly what's going on. So the first word, obviously, the first point here is he renews my soul. So he's done this before. Hashem's done this before. But also, in terms of he guides me in the right paths as befits his name, it sort of means, I'm being a good shepherd, so Hashem will take care of my shepherdhood. In other words, I'm doing the right thing as a shepherd, so Hashem will take care of, will lead me to the right places to benefit my sheep. And again, of course, obviously, there's the parallel that Hashem is a shepherd for us. So Hashem is a good shepherd. And obviously Hashem is going to shepherd humanity with righteousness, with tzedek. The fourth pasuk, though I walk through the valley of death, I feel no harm, for you're with me. So literally, it does say valley of death, but most commentators take that as Hebrew poetic. That doesn't literally mean valley of death. It means, with me and my sheep, I walk through some rough areas, but I'm not going to worry about it because I'm comfortable that Hashem is going to take care of me and my sheep. Notice also, halfway through the pasuk, it switches from third person to second person. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You may ask yourself, what's the difference between your rod and your staff, right? It's sort of the same thing. It's two separate words, but obviously there's an intent here that both words are used. The idea is that your rod is what you hit with, right? Your rod is what you give a putch to your sheep when they're going off in the wrong direction, and your staff is the staff is more than what you lean on. It helps you walk. Um, they comfort me. The point is that, and this is the beginning of a longer. We'll get to this again later. In other words, the bad things and the good things, they comfort me because I know they come from Hashem, and this idea that we'll get, we have challenges in our life, and they actually benefit us in the long run. We'll come back to that. And then the last two pasukim seem like from a totally different scene. It's like a play or a movie where there's a black screen, and then it opens up in a totally different scene. You spread out a table for me in full view of my enemies. Like, where is he? He was just being a shepherd before. Now, in full view of my enemies, I did not know how to translate that. I looked in a bunch of English translations. I wasn't sure. The Hebrew word here is neged, and keneged can mean associated with, corresponding to. It could mean in opposition to. It could mean like sitting across from. So it's hard to picture what's going on here, but I think if you use any of those translations, your enemy is aware that you're sitting at the table, and that Hashem spread out the table for you. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. What is that about? And we'll get to that in a minute. And then the last pasuk. Only goodness and love shall pursue me all the days of my life. I'll dwell in the house of the Lord for many long. So that answers the question of where is he probably in pasuk number 5. You spread out a table for me. This is the shepherd is in God's house. So it had a happy ending. He had faith in God, and he had a happy ending. Obviously, there's more to this than that, because there's got to be. Why else is it so important, right? So there are many interpretations of this, of the overall, taking a big picture view of this whole thing. So I want to talk about a couple of them, and then focus on one, and then sort of leave with two main messages. The first, and you'll see similarities in all these. Actually, there's like 4 main interpretations I ran into. There's similarities in 3 of them. I'll talk about those. The first one is that this is the story of Bnei Israel. The picture we just read, right? The going through the hard places, the valley of the death, this and that, and then you're sitting at the table, and your cup runneth over. So after coming, it says Bnei Israel, after coming out of Mitzrayim, gave us the Torah. Then he led us through the desert, right? He was a shepherd for us. He completely protected us, right? I shall have no, what is my shepherd? I shall not want, right? We didn't want for anything, right? Hashem provided for us the man and the clouds of glory to protect us from the sun and the winds and the well of Miriam. And how did it ended with a happy ending, so to speak, right? We arrived in Eretz Yisrael, which eventually culminated in us sitting at Hashem's house, the Beis HaMikdash. Another view is somewhat similar, but instead of talking about Bnei Israel in the past, it's talking about Bnei Israel all throughout history and what's going on up till today. The very fact that the Jews have survived for 2,000 years without a land, that is Hashem's protection. And of course, under this interpretation, the last 2 pasukim then would be the future. Sitting in Hashem's house would be the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, the 3rd Beis HaMikdash. Or perhaps this is something that's starting now. when I think of this interpretation and I get to that verse of, sitting across from my enemies or in full view of my enemies, you can't help but think of the current state of the state of Israel, right? Which is situated right in the middle of so many enemies. And it perfectly corresponds to, setting a table keneged my enemies. Like, there we are, Hashem's helping us stay here, even though there's hundreds of millions of you guys that don't want us here. The final interpretation I find most interesting, and I want to focus on that one, and that is the Malbim's interpretation. Rather than talk about how it is the history of Bnei Israel, or rather than talk about how it's the future of Bnei Israel, he says that it's talking about the totality of the life of David HaMelech himself. And, tradition posits that he wrote this. So, right, what was David HaMelech's journey? He started off, he was, mamish a shepherd, right? And he got plucked, right from shepherdhood to kingship. Like, I was going to say immediately, not quite immediately, but he was a shepherd when the prophet Shmuel picked him out and said, "You're going to be the next king." And so at the beginning of his life, the first however many years, he's alone, he's with the sheep in the desert, and he's picturing himself in a lush area, that's got flowing with water, tranquility. David is a shepherd for the sheep, and Hashem is a shepherd for David. And David's looking around, and everything seems great. It's interesting, by the way, that that all of our patriarchs were shepherds, right? We have, I'm trying to, that all of our patriarchs were shepherds. Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe Rabbeinu also was a shepherd. Hi, Ellie, welcome. And part of the idea is that when you're alone like that, you can find the creator. You can, you have time to sit and think. With other professions, there's a hustle and bustle of life, but with tranquility, you can contemplate without that noise. And this was a valuable time for life, a valuable time in David's life. I once heard, y'all might know, you've all known, Adam Berman talks about an analogy between that and the teva of Noach, being totally ensconced and protected for a year and then going out into life, and comparing that to his yeshiva days when he's in yeshiva in Israel in his gap year. He's protected from all outside influence. He can just like sit and commune with God and learn Torah. But then eventually you got to go. that you sort of fortify yourself, but then you got to go out into the real world. So what happened to David HaMelech, right? Hashem, through Shmuel and Avi, literally plucked him out from the fields and made him king. And his vocation, so to speak, changed from being a shepherd of sheep to a shepherd of his people. And the Malbim takes the view that David HaMelech didn't really want to do this, that he wanted a life of tranquility and peace, and that the first couple of Pesukim reflect this longing for the simple days when he could be out in the fields of the sheep and contemplate with Hashem. David HaMelech wants to be alone with Hashem. We say this kapitel of Tehillim usually on Shabbos. There's a whole bunch of customs about when you say it on Shabbos, and that's a whole nother discussion itself. But the point I'm bringing that up is that, we spend all of Shabbos also extracting ourselves from the craziness of the week. And then we get to, that third meal, Suda Shlishis, and there's a custom among many Ashkenazim to sing this kapitel of Tehillim. I remember once I was in the house of somebody, their minhag, Rabbi Teitelbaum, and their minhag was to sing this kapitel, 3 times with 3 different melodies at the third meal. Now, what's very interesting, one thing I want to compare is this very last verse here. I shall dwell in the house of Hashem for many years, which really, I mean, if you know your Tehillim well, it cries out for comparison of another pasuk. Tehillim 27 is something that we say in the month of Elul. And we say it, right? We say it twice a day, all of Elul up through Hoshana Rabbah or something, 49 or 50 days. And it says, and he also says almost the same thing. One thing I ask of the Lord, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to frequent and visit his temple. So that's a common theme. The question then is, does David HaMelech, does he want to be in the fields, or does he want to be in the house of Hashem? And if he's a king, how can he be a guest somewhere else? So one thing that the Malbim might be saying is that David HaMelech saw his kingship as a means to an end. He recognized that at the end of the day, he can't spend all his days out in the fields. As we know, as probably we all know, that's one of the that was one of the errors that the spies made, right? The spies are in the desert communing with Hashem. And if you take the view that really the spies were biased against going into Eretz Yisrael because life was going to get too complicated and they wouldn't have this blissful life. So maybe David HaMelech recognized, I'm king. I can't make the same mistake that the spies made. I have to deal with the world, and that this kingship apparently is my mission in life. And metaphorically speaking, that is how I dwell in the house of Hashem, by doing the mission that apparently God has planned out for me. I want to point out one other an interesting thing about this last verse of the other kapitel of Tehillim. It says, I want to dwell in the house. Oops, here it is. I want to dwell in the house of Hashem all the days of my life. And this last, where's the word I'm looking for? Baboker. Babayza. Kol yimei chaye. Lachazos benom ulavaker beheichalu. Lavaker means to meet or greet. And it sort of seems contradictory that I want to live in the house the whole time and I want to visit your house. So I think, is that a contradictory type idea? Let's think about if you're a guest in the house or the owner of the house. There's advantages and disadvantages to both, right? So if I'm the owner, say there's a meal, if I'm the owner, I can choose the meal, I can choose the menu, I can choose when the meal starts and when it ends, right? How many of us has been in a house in a meal where the meal's going on too long? On the other hand, right, the drawback is you have to make the meal and do the setup, you do the cleanup afterwards. As a guest, you don't have to do anything, but you have to be willing to give up control. So David HaMelech is saying, with the combination of both these kapitles of Tehillim, that Hashem wants us to take ownership of our lives here in this world. We should feel like the host. We need to take ownership. We have a responsibility to the world around us. And yet, we should also feel like we're a guest in Hashem's world. We're not in control, except for our actions and reactions. Essentially, we say, Hashem, I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do my hishtadlis, but ultimately, it's up to you. at the end of the day, I know that in actuality, I'm a guest in your world. I'm not an interloper because you invited me here. Um, but we do have a mission. And as the saying goes, we can only control what we can control. I want to just mention one slightly different angle that I think puts everything I just said into even better perspective. And perhaps this is what the Malbim meant, not that David HaMelech longed for the past, but that he appreciated his past. I think there's a really, really important message. Each of the interpretations I've given before actually involve a journey and a destination, whether it means Bnei Israel, whether it was talking about the times of the Torah, they spent 40 years in the desert and they eventually arrived in Eretz Yisrael and built a base of Mikdash, right? That was interpretation one. Interpretation two was that it's the current journey that we're on. It's the whole history of the Jewish people, that we are, Hashem's protecting us throughout history, and eventually it'll end up with the building of the third Beis Hamikdash, right? Benhera Beyamenu. Or this third interpretation, that was the journey of David HaMelech, that he was a shepherd. He got to know Hashem, he understood Hashem, and then that gave him the tools to be a king when he finally became the king. So viewing all of that as a journey and destination, maybe David HaMelech, or maybe what the Malbim was saying, is that David HaMelech understood that you need the journey in order to get to the destination, and that there are setbacks in the journey, right? The pasuk that's even though I walk through the valley of death, many of us have had setbacks in our lives. We feel like we've been walking through, right, the valley of the death. And that was the staff that or the rod that we were talking about earlier. That's getting a patch from Hashem, maybe getting us back onto the right path. The 40 years in the desert can be seen as a punishment for the spies, but it can also be seen as a time when Bnei Israel really grew into a nation. And so too with us, we have setbacks and we grow from them. Whenever I think of that, I think of being a football fan in the DC area. Joe Theismann was the big hotshot football star from Notre Dame and was a great quarterback for the Washington, then known as Redskins. And on Monday Night Football, he was the victim of a terrible incident. But he was tackled and he totally smashed his leg by Lawrence Taylor. It ended his career in one instant. And I was reading about him like 20 years later. Maybe it was the anniversary of that incident or something like that. And he said that was the best thing that happened to him in his life. And at first I was thinking, he had it all. He was the big guy. He had a chain of restaurants with his name. I mean, he was the top dog. And in DC, we didn't have baseball at the time. There was only one sport, football. Nobody paid attention to hockey or basketball. It's like, how is that the best thing that happened into his life? And as he started talking, and then as I thought back to what he was like back then, I got it. His view is that, look, first of all, there's more important things than football. And also, he was a brash, cocky, arrogant jerk of a guy, right? It all went to his head. He was somewhat good looking. He was, on top of the world. He was great. Everybody praised him. And it went to his head. And I don't know if he was into, fast times and fast women and fast, drugs or alcohol. I don't know if he was into that stuff. But I think in retrospect, he looked back and he saw that his life was going in a bad direction, at least personal wise. I mean, his football career was doing great, but as a person, he was going in the wrong direction. And he understood that, and apparently he understood that. And I think many people have had, setbacks, maybe not as dramatic as that, but when they come out of the other end from setbacks, they they have a new perspective on life, a better perspective on life. There's this concept, these setbacks from Hashem are called Yisurin. And the Gemara talks about Yisurin Ba'ahava. It's these tough times that are really blessings from Hashem, if we can get through those tough times. And we hope when we get a metaphorical patch from Hashem that it's with love, and it's done with well, we know it's done with love, and it's done with with intentions to get us on a better track. And so, in summary, this Kapitel of Tehillim, I think, has two complementary messages here. The first is that life is a journey, and it's going to have ups and it's going to have downs, and we trust in Hashem that it's all going to turn out all right. And then in the meantime, we do our best. Our lives are all that we have, so it's a gift, and our families are a gift, and we should appreciate the journey and understand that it can, when we make good decisions, get us to a good place. And the other message is that in the end, all we control is our own actions. David HaMelech is a king. He's at the pinnacle of power. And yet at the end, all he wants to do is to ask Hashem to set a table for him. He recognizes that Hashem is the host and he's a guest. He's a guest in Hashem's world. And as a guest, he puts his faith that the host is going to take care of him. And I think it's a beautiful thing to think about. Those two complementary messages. And my guess is that that's why this is such an important chapter of Tehillim. I'm going to stop the share here. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll let everybody stop.